Help protect us from racism and xenophobia by becoming an I Love Black People ambassador today. Join on iloveblackpeople.com. No matter where you are in the world, join us today and get access to the I Love Black People network. Special thanks to Banneker Communities.
And welcome to another edition of I Love Black People. And again, thank you for joining us and being a part of this journey. It's been incredible with your support, and the time that we spend together is priceless. So we just always are very humbled and appreciative of your inputs, your suggestions. As a co-founder of I Love Black People, one of the things that we try to make sure that we're clear about is that the work that we're doing is literally for our people. This is why we're here at I Love Black People. It's not just a radio show. It's not just a startup. It's really is a way of life. And we love our people, and we demonstrate that love every day. We get up in the morning and put our agendas into action. So thank you so much for being a part of this episode. We're going to really also touch on what's going on in the blockchain Bitcoin space. It's been reaching all-time highs. And as you know, as co-founder I Love Black People, our origin story starts off actually when we were building using Bitcoin. And we pivoted to be more useful and more constructive in building a safety net to protect our people from racism and Afrophobia. But our origin story starts off when we were literally trying to make sure that our people weren't being exploited by the current financial and monetary system leveraging Bitcoin. And we started off as a Bitmari. And Bitmari, money means, Amari means money in Shona, which is one of the, and Ndebele in Zimbabwe. So our origin story started with my co-founder, Mr. Christopher Mapendera, who also attended Howard University, HU, and he basically mentored and guided us through, being originally from Zimbabwe, through all the foundational and the structural issues and norms in Zimbabwe. And from that, we again, one of the key issues was that after their independence struggle in 1980, the United States and the Britain were supposed to compensate the Rhodesians, who were the colonizers that invaded and savagely, brutally destroyed much of the civilization that was there. They were supposed to be, and they came from England. They were supposed to be compensated for giving up their land after losing to the Zimbabweans, and that didn't happen. It was called the Lancaster House Agreement. The United States reneged, and the UK reneged in 1990. Now, some of this again goes back to geopolitical things. A lot of people don't realize that one of the key inflection points of our lives, those who are Gen Xers, is that the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the fall of the Berlin Wall took place in 1989. I kind of remember that because I actually pledged in 1989. Kind of outside your baby, yeah. But literally, 1989 was an inflection point because during the previous periods, during what they called the Cold War, there were literally was two polar powers. It was the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and we still are familiar with NATO because it still exists. But at that time, it was allegedly there in order to be a counterbalance to communism and the Warsaw Pact. Now, the Warsaw Pact no longer exists. However, NATO remains. In lies some of the issues, because again, the original prevailing thought was that these allies or treaties were created in order to address, geopolitical, f- you know, truths on the ground. And now, since once the Berlin Wall fell, that meant that communism fell, and ultimately, again, it dissolved the Soviet Union into multiple countries and dissolved the Warsaw Pact. What happened in Africa and many Asian and South American, and Cuba included, that when there was two of these like powers, if you were not supported, especially those who had been colonized, if you think about it, NATO includes the members of those who literally, for the last almost 500 years, went around the world savagely destroying civilization and disrupting communities. So when countries were seeking independence, they didn't go to England or to the United States, to London or to Washington, D.C. Uh, they literally went to the Soviet Union. They went to China. They went to East Germany, even North Korea for support. And in that way, oftentimes they would characterize these communities as being um, communist. But most of these folks were more nationalists in the sense that they weren't studiers of Marx or Engel or any of those philosophies. They literally wanted their sovereignty back. And that movement of getting the sovereignty back, of course, is about independence. And one of those countries that were late to get their sovereignty, because most African nations, even in Asia, most of these countries got their independence in the 60s, and then a few more in the 70s. Uh, but then Zimbabwe got their independence in 1980, but through armed struggle. And I think some of that is often lost. Some countries were able to get their independence through agreements and treaties. Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, Angola. There's countries that literally had to go to war. Algeria had to go to war with a colonizer in order to defeat them, in order for them to get their independence. And Zimbabwe was one of those countries that did that. And once they did that, there was a treaty or agreement, and it was an agreement, not a treaty, called the Lancaster House Agreement, which said that um, the ZANU, who was key in winning with Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo, that they would literally be able to govern the country, and the land that was taken by the colonizers would be compensated by the UK and the United States in order to stop the African Revolution and to go about a new independent Zimbabwe from a Rhodesia. Now, they agreed to that in 1980. They said that we're going to do initial transfer of lands. Willing seller, they called it William Buyer, where much of the land that really wasn't that good. But then the Rhodesians that held on to the land still, by 1990, they would be compensated by the UK and US. Well, under this is all happening in 1980 in the heart of the Cold War. So many of the negotiations were also being done with the backdrop of there was a fear that Zimbabwe and many other countries would become communist. And even in the United States, with the war with Vietnam was very unfortunate. Many of our family members died, had no idea where Vietnam was, but just were escaping poverty and racism in the United States. Literally, there was a real issue of trying to figure out, okay, the domino theory. And so what they tried to, what was a geopolitical concept was that, one country falls to communism and then the surrounding areas would fall. So you had to stop the dominoes. I mean, it was something like that. So if Zimbabwe becomes independent and communist, then all the surrounding uh, frontline nations would become threatened by with communism. That was the spook. It almost like they use the communism spooky thing, almost like how they use terrorism. You create this straw person that's going to kill everybody, eat everybody, and then you now attack it. And if it is real or not, it doesn't matter because now you've used it as a just cause to, again, violence and all the other things we've seen consistently with these never-ending wars. Well, once the Berlin Wall fell, the fear of communism became much less, and the West, the NATO powers, basically saw that they had won in a way, contextually, the battle against communism. So when they were supposed to compensate the Zimbabweans, the indigenous African people that lived on the land that had fought with, with a war to get their land and get their sovereignty back. When that was the agreement that stopped that was now to be executed in 1990, the Zimbabweans were told that they were not going to get the support they were supposed to get. And then they also then delayed because the ANC, African National Congress, wanted to make sure that they got their freedom in South Africa. And they were concerned that if ZANU PF, the ruling party in Zimbabwe, had raised the flag and saying, "Hey, this is wrong. This is not what we agreed," that would undermine the negotiations of the power and release of Mandela in South Africa. So there was a whole bunch of things going on. Make a long story short, because we're talking about some Bitcoin here and blockchain, was that we literally got to 2000 and the land that was fought for was still controlled by those who had invaded and savagely and ruthlessly stolen and raped and killed. And so those war veterans that had fought in the war that ended in 1980 said, "We're going to take over these lands." And Robert Mugabe, instead of removing those soldiers and saying, "Hey, you can't do that," he literally went to the Zimbabwe parliament and said, "Look, we're going to legalize these activities by calling it the fast track land reform. The things that were promised in 1990, we're going to now make sure they're done through what's taking place already with the um, war veterans." And so after that, the Bush administration of the United States basically created a sanction regime to basically punish the Zimbabweans from taking their land back from those who had stolen and raped and killed their family. And from that, they also, all kinds of espionage, discrediting, undermining the currency. Fast forward to that is when, we entered and said, "Look, Zimbabwe is an awesome country. They're dealing with all these economic issues. How can we help?" And in Zimbabwe and in many parts of the world, uh, remittances is the biggest driver of many of these economies. Meaning, unfortunately, because of colonialism and the undermining of African nations by the former colonizers and the espionage and the stealing of resources we see in the DRC and things going on in Sudan, like literally these countries are undermined by the same colonizers that for 500 years have undermined them. So it creates an environment where it's difficult economically. And so many of the best and brightest of African people end up leaving to find other jobs. And what happens is, and this is another thing we hear about immigration, and we talk about it in the middle of the story, not the beginning. And as an engineer, I'm a mechanical engineer, Tuskegee, TU, and Howard. That you got to go to the first principles. You don't start the conversation about immigration in the middle. You start in the beginning. And what you'll see, the confluence of how all this comes together, is that the former colonial invaders end up still destabilizing these countries in order to get cheap markets, cheap resources, and the most important thing they get is cheap labor. So literally, you get a situation on the continent of Africa, some of the best and brightest end up going to Europe as well as United States and other places, and then they send money back. And they don't go to these other places because they're treated well or they're great places. They go because of money and the access to resources. Even though they come from resource rich countries, the access to these resources don't benefit them. They benefit the colonial invaders. And then from there, they end up building up other economies throughout Europe and in North America at the expense of their own home country. So those folks, when they're abroad, what they do is they send money back to their parents and family members. And those funds are critical for the stabilizing of families and communities. But here we go again. The colonial invaders, the former colonial invaders, they literally see this as another opportunity because that's why remittance prices were so, costs were so, fees were so high. So, sending money at the time when we started Bitmari was, I mean, it could be almost like 20% on your dollar sending money from South Africa to Zimbabwe, while sending money from the United States to India could be 3%. So what was happening is they were really putting a high cost on transactions in Zimbabwe and other countries in order to exploit our African communities. And it wasn't because of technology, it was because it was a business model. Again, I think sometimes we forget colonialism is not inevitable. Rape, killing, so the cause of colonialism is the colonizer. The cause of rape is the rapist. There's nothing about the nature of life or the natural order of things where rape and colonialism makes sense. These are all very problematic, exploitive, harmful, violent actions. However, these are the things that we currently are living in, and they become normalized. So, instead of saying what's the best for humanity, it becomes what's the best for my capital. And again, that's probably not only unnatural, it's probably inhumane and contextually ahistorical. I say ahistorical because the world that we live in spent tens of thousands of years. The civilization we live in spent tens of thousands of years not having capitalism. So capitalism is not the origin story of civilization. We had languages, science, math. We had everything we have now well before there was capitalism. And the world that created all those wonderful things was not created through capitalism. So when we talk about the context of why and how we get into these places, there's a definitely intertwining of so many pieces that if we kind of start undoing them, we realize that this is again unsustainable, besides unnatural. So when we're looking at how this exploitation of remittances was taking place, they have a duopoly oftentimes. And now we also, back when we started, the World Remit wasn't this big, but it was really MoneyGram and Western Union. And what they knew is that there was very few options for African peoples to send money, so they exploited that um, pairing or that channel between North America and Africa. So what we decided to do was focus on how can we make funding, sending money back to Zimbabwe cheaper. And when Bitcoin came out, again, this was after I dealt with quite a bit of politics in Washington, D.C. I kind of had gotten away from my engineering roots, which I could trust engineering. You can't trust politics. Politics is what it is. It's definitely built on duplicity. It's one of the only professions where you can lie and they'll obfuscate it and call it spinning, and people give you accolades for spinning things or not telling the truth. A plumber spinning something is a liar. A mechanic who spins something is a liar. Politician that spins something is might be called dynamic or something wild. So this getting into the engineering space and looking at how to solve these problems that we're facing, not with politics in the purest state of it, meaning electoral, or not purest, but in the electoral or the legislative context, but how to solve it using engineering or technology. So instead of protesting Western Union or MoneyGram, we said, look, let's come up with an alternative that's infinitely better than working with those two duopolies. Let's come up with a way that we can benefit using Bitcoin technology, which at the time that we launched our startup in 2015, 10 years ago, Bitcoin had only been around for you know, barely like 6 years. So it was a very early nascent technology, but we saw it as a possible solution to a literally, 400, 500 year problem, exploitation of Africa by the colonial invaders. And so we spent that time coming up with the leadership of Christopher Mapindera, our co-founder, with ways that we could actually engage with changing that policy, to change the way that money can be moved. And what was great with Mr. Mapindera, again, he was based in the United States and Zim in many cases, and had contacts as well as a. We had been doing work looking at ethanol in Zimbabwe, dealing with some of their financial issues, looking at ways that we could actually take a distillery, basically take a rum distillery in their called a Triangle region where they have sugarcane and distill it a bit further so it can be used as ethanol. But again, even with some of these small projects that we thought we would be advantageous to create, again, moving money from the States to Zimbabwe was always cumbersome and difficult. Uh, it's difficult in any African country looking at currency exchange and all that, but also even more with OFIC sanctions. So we had to be very, very careful about how we moved so that we would not run you know, contrary to any laws or anything, even if the laws were unjust. This is the problem. What we don't see oftentimes those who uh, are taxpayers in America. The United States government is doing things in our name using our taxpayers' dollars that aren't right. And so it's oftentimes we complain about it domestically, but many of the things that are being done domestically that are harmful or even worse contextually by the US government abroad. So when we were trying to move money, it was very difficult to do the ethanol project. And that, even pushed us further in thinking of how can we better come up with a way to be helpful to the people of Zimbabwe, leveraging technology. And, agriculture was another thing that we had worked with that was very interesting and helpful. But it was important that we figure out a way to kind of like break those barriers so it wouldn't be a issue of moving value. Excuse me, it would be more about how incredible that actual project is. So with that being said, our early stage, we literally saw leveraging Bitcoin to transact and then pay out in USD in the country. And what Zimbabwe had done that was kind of masterful. I know in 2008, everyone knows about the economic crisis in the United States, where the banks had to get bailed out. Well, just imagine, a country like the United States is able to print more money without creating, well, it still devalues the dollar, but without catastrophic consequences. Well, Zimbabwe tried to print the dollar just like the US did, but their dollar, the Zim dollar, wasn't the US dollar. So when they did it, it created hyperinflation. So it doesn't happen in the United States. The United States has nuclear weapons and could force people to use their dollar. Zimbabwe didn't have the same luxury. So it ended up creating hyperinflation. The hyperinflation, I mean, again, that's when you hear people talk the $1 million, $1 trillion notes. That caused, another issue where now it took away the confidence. And what a lot of people don't realize with monetary policy and finances in general, a lot of this is about psychology, people's trust, people's good faith. And when we bring up white supremacist ideology, it's not to try to, cry about something or be a victim. It's actually to, take note and clearly identify the phenomenon that we're dealing with as it relates to our everyday life. If someone puts a certain group of people at a premium and then they put a certain group of people at a discount, that means anything that certain people they see as a discount do, they're not going to see it have value. And then just on the other side, if they see a certain other people at a premium, no matter what they do, they're going to see it as valuable. Even if those people, let's talk about monetary power, have no gold, have no natural resources, they still will say, "Oh, that must be amazing." And then the people with actual resources, since the perception is they're not valuable, they're going to get discounted. So in many ways, European countries have used that sense that if it's just almost like you when you hear Swiss chocolate, chocolate. There's no cocoa plants in Switzerland. Like literally, to associate chocolate with Switzerland doesn't make sense because it's again that cocoa is coming from Africa. The same thing with British tea. Like tea does not grow in England or any of the UK. It's going on in India, China, and in Africa. But because of this, perception, there's a thing that people see those things as being better than actually the people that actually grow the things. Like you can't imagine, even the coffee, all these things. And these are all things that are enjoyed in many parts of the world where they can't even produce them. But yet, those parts of the world are looked at as a premium, and the places that these bananas, oranges, all the things that people enjoy, pineapples, all that is put at a discount. And then that's, again, a perception thing. The colonial system works and how it still impacts us and how we can come up with solutions that actually solve these problems utilizing something that people are talking about called Bitcoin. So again, I just want to thank everyone who's joined us. The next episode, we're going to continue this conversation. I just definitely want to let you all know that we appreciate all the support all of you have given us throughout this long journey. And as I always end, I am because we are. Thank you.
Help protect us from racism and xenophobia by becoming an I Love Black People ambassador today. Join on iloveblackpeople.com. No matter where you are in the world, join us today and get access to the I Love Black People network. Special thanks to Banneker Communities.